Okay, awesome. This is great. Okay, I'm going to get started. So thank you for joining us. I'm Mara Walsh, and I'll be here with you today alongside my good friend, Elena Salerno. Before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a group leader for EF Tours. I started leading tours as a Girl Scout leader, which many of you know, and we take girls and their families to international destinations every summer. And I have since expanded my travel program. I've added adult-only tours as well as family-friendly tours. Since we're not able to travel this summer, I started out by thinking, well, what can we do to get everybody together and feel the buzz and excitement of travel? We started to say, let's do some virtual tours. This is our third tour, which has been awesome. We've done Rome, we've done Edinburgh, and today we do Paris. I have a few more lined up for later on in the summer. We have London and we have Peru. And then there's a couple more on the table that have not been announced yet. They've been a big success. Thank all of you for attending. We have about 100 people on right now, and I'm sure it will continue to add as we move forward into the presentation today. But before we get started, I wanted to share a few things for you all so that you know how you can interact with us. Feel free to ask a question about Paris, our tour director, or my travel program by using the Q&A link on your toolbar. We will have a Q&A session after the tour. So you can send your questions throughout the tour so that we have them logged for when we do that. You can also reach out to us via the chat if you have other types of questions, technical or just questions that don't apply to the tour. We are also going to have a poll, and we're actually going to do that right now. I'm going to launch the poll, and this will give us an understanding of what Paris means to you and how you're connected to Paris. So right now I'm going to launch the poll. The question is, what's your connection to Paris? I've been and love it. I have a trip booked. I plan to go in the future, or I'm solely interested in experiencing this virtually. I'm going to give you a minute to respond. And it looks like a lot of us have been there before, probably more than half of us have been there before. I'm going to end the poll if you're all finished, and I'm going to share it with you so that you can see the results as well. But essentially 53% of us have been there and love it. There are many with a trip booked and that are planning to go in the future. So that gives us an understanding of where you all are, and probably will help our tour director in knowing how to deliver her talk to you. So let's now talk about the tour director. Okay, so a tour would not be complete without a fantastic tour director. As you may know, a tour director is like a personal travel concierge. They stay with you and the group from start to finish, and they share their world of knowledge. They manage all the travel plans, and they make sure your experience is stressless and full of positive experiences. These are by far the most important people in the group. And you can imagine right now, if we are not traveling, they have no work. Most of these tour directors have between 6 and 20 tours booked in a year, and they rely on the tour for their income as well as the gratuities from the tour. So hopefully we'll make up a little bit of that with our tipping later on after we experience this virtual tour. I'm hoping that this virtual tour will not only reignite our desire to travel, but will also allow a tour director to do what she does best, which is share her knowledge and passion. Because you can imagine she hasn't been able to engage other than virtually with people. So it does help, I think, both of us to sort of reignite our passion for travel. One of my absolute favorite tour directors just happens to be an expert in Paris as well as most of Europe. And many of us have met Elena on our first virtual tour to Rome, and we're lucky to have her back with us today to share her unique perspective of Paris. For those that haven't experienced Elena yet, you will not be disappointed in what she delivers today. And now I'm going to hand over this event to Elena. She is our amazing tour director today, and she's going to take it over, and you can take the controls as well, Elena.
Thank you, Mara. No pressure, right? You talked me up too much. Hello, everyone, and let me thank you all for joining us tonight and for dedicating a little bit of your very precious time with us. I hope this presentation will be enjoyable and will not reignite, because I know you already have it, but grow the passion that I know you all have for traveling. So let me share my screen. Share screen so you can all see. There you go. The slides that I have prepared for tonight. Paris, the city of lights. So let's start. Very brief outline so that you know what to expect from the virtual visit that I'm going to lead tonight, as we did for Rome. I decided to give a title to tonight's event while I was putting together the presentation, and I decided to name it The Unthinkable Made Possible, because who would have thought that we could cram Paris in a less than an hour or so presentation? I'm going to start with a very brief general intro, and then we are going to have a virtual visit of the city. But this time, and especially for the ones of you who followed the Rome event, I changed a little bit the criterion that I decided to use. And instead of having a geographical one, as if we were on a walk through the streets of the city, because this time the area, of course, is way larger than the one we did last time, I decided to use the time criterion. So I divided Paris's history into different chapters, and for each chapter, of course, I had to choose. So this is definitely not a comprehensive Parisian tour, but I chose one or two monuments or events that symbolize that specific era of Paris's history. We're going to have a couple pit stops along the way so that we can also learn a little bit about yummy things that the Parisians have to offer. And then I added a little Easter egg to cap it all off and end the presentation. Let's start. So the first thing is to show you Paris latitude, so where it is placed within the planet. And I did this especially because this is the way I started with Rome, so to keep, a continuity in style. So Paris is the dot that I marked on the line. The line represents the 49th parallel. And to give you a comparison with the placement within Northern America, there are no large metropolitan areas along this parallel, but it was used when they had to trace the border between Canada and the US. So the segment that I highlighted in the map is the piece of the border that follows exactly the line of the 49th parallel. I think there is an expression, isn't it? North of the 49th parallel to mean Canada if you're talking from the US, and it comes from this. Where is Paris within the nation of which is the capital? It's right there to the northeast, close to the border with Belgium. And before talking in detail about this beautiful city, I thought, since many of you experience Paris on tours and many of you have it in their future as a trip, that you might be interested to know what a few of the locations just outside of Paris are that can be visited with a half-day or a full-day excursion. So just, of course, this is not, again, comprehensive, but Versailles would be the first place in mind. A small town southeast of Paris where you get to visit the grand, gorgeous palace left behind by the kings of France that served as a residence, as a royal palace for so many centuries, together with its breathtaking gardens. The picture really doesn't do justice to the immensity and how gorgeous these gardens are. Again, from Paris, so with a very short trip, you can reach the beaches to the north that are part of a region called Normandy. And in Normandy, the beaches are especially important for us to remember the happenings of the D-Day landings during World War II. So we just had the anniversary of D-Day, which was the 6th of June. When you visit Normandy, you can, of course, walk along these beautiful beaches. The landscape is fantastic. You see there are some remnants from those days. And of course, the region is also filled with war memorials, war cemeteries, and monuments that pay a homage and keep our memories alive of these very important events. And then again, from Paris, a very short distance away, is a town called Giverny, which is the place where Monet, the painter Monet, spent his last years. So his home, which is a beautiful countryside mansion, has been turned into a museum that we can nowadays visit. And also his gardens, which are so important, were so important for him and for this location, are visitable. And we can see in the gardens some features like the pond with the water lilies and the Japanese bridge that you see in the picture that featured in so many of his paintings. By the way, the paintings by Monet are mainly housed in Paris's museums. So if you are interested in art, and especially in Impressionism, you could, during your trip, enjoy the paintings while visiting the museums, and then also go see where so many of them were conceived. And then finally, and this is especially a nod to Mara, because I know she has it coming up next year on her tour, you've got Disneyland Paris. So zooming in a little bit, this is a map of the city of Paris. It's a blank map, and it gives us a very precise idea of the course of the river that runs through the city, which is called Seine, and of course had a great importance throughout Paris's history. Now, to understand Paris, and also I think Parisian mentality, it is important to know that the city is, administratively speaking, divided into what the French call arrondissements, or we would say districts, so clusters of neighborhoods that are numbered. They start from the very central one, number 1. You see, it's the very core of the city, and they progress clockwise with a snail-like design. So they go around in larger circles all the way to the last one, which is the 20th. And what I mean when I say that this tells us a lot about Parisian mentality is that Parisians are a bit snobbish. In a cute way, of course, but they are a bit snobbish. So when you live in Paris and you meet with someone who wants to, identify you, they will not ask what your job is or what your address is, but they will ask you what arrondissement you live in. And of course, there are some that are acceptable, like of course, number 1, 3, and 4, and 8 are very prestigious. Everything else, they get a little bit suspicious maybe. Now, before we start, one last thing, I thought if we were actually together in the streets of Paris visiting the city, I would have liked to use the mean of transportation that Parisians always choose, very, very French, which they call métro, and is their subway. Their fantastic subway system is cheap, it's very fast, it's very, very efficient. In the photo here, you see a sign that marks the entrance to a station, but if you walk through the streets of Paris, you see many other. It has become a form of art, really, designing the entrances of these beautiful stations. We have some very old ones like this one designed at the beginning of the 1900s. And then you can also encounter, of course, more modern ones like this one that was designed in 2000, made with these 2 open domes made of glass beads, of Venetian glass beads. Couple of numbers regarding the metro. It was inaugurated in 1900, so it is a very old subway system. But contrary to what sometimes we are certain of, it's not the oldest one in the world, it's the 4th oldest. Before came London, which is really the first one in the world, and then Budapest, followed by Glasgow. So Paris is only the 4th in the world. It comprises nowadays the 16 lines that run for a little more than 130 miles with a total of 303 stops. So it's a really complex, efficient system. And had we been using the metro, we would be part of the 4.5 million people that use it a day, or 1.6 billion passengers per year. So impressive numbers. Now, for our first chapter, birth, from the origins to the Middle Ages. We will start geographically from one of the only two islands on the river. The biggest one of the two that you see encircled in red, it's called Île de la Cité, or Island of the City. And this is where Paris was born. Paris was born a long, long time ago, many moons ago, before Christ. And the first core of Paris was founded by the Romans. So Julius Caesar himself conquered this part of France and established the first city that then became Paris. They were calling it Lutetia, and it all started on the island of the city. What remains of those ancient times can be found scattered throughout the city, but mainly on the island underground. It has been discovered, you see it in the photo, during excavations done in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in the 1960s, when they had a project of building an underground parking lot. But during the excavations, they found the remains of Roman Paris, and they decided to keep them and open up what is today named the Archaeological Crypt of Notre Dame. So this is a visitable space where you can admire what the Romans left behind, or what remains of what the Romans left behind. Of course, talking about the Middle Ages, the most famous, renowned symbol of that age in Paris is definitely the Cathedral of Notre Dame. In this image, you see it in a very old painting that allows us to understand what the space in front of Notre Dame looked for so many centuries. It wasn't opened as it is nowadays. Nowadays, we have this beautiful square and we can admire the whole facade, even when coming from afar. Whereas before, the square, the space that is now the square, was filled with buildings. And in approaching the cathedral, you just had a glimpse of it in between the buildings. And then at some point, they decided to demolish all the buildings and to open up the square that, that now welcomes us when getting to Notre Dame. This is a photo of the inside that I particularly like because, well, first of all, being an aerial photo, it really kind of takes it all in and gives you an idea of the grandness, the shape of the inside of the church. But also when you do visit it, other than during these COVID-ridden times, usually it's filled with tourists and visitors and believers. So it's kind of difficult to actually grasp what the church looks like from the inside. And I also included a couple of images. This is the behind of the church. You see, it is really at the tip of the island, and a photo of the side. In my opinion, the outside is almost more beautiful than the inside. It was built in this, what we call the Gothic style. And so many features, especially the flying arches, the outside flying buttresses that allow for so many windows. They hold up basically the weight of the cathedral, allowing for the walls to be very, very thin and leave space for the beautiful stained glasses. A picture of Notre Dame at night, because of course it is beautifully lit up, so it's really gorgeous to see it also at night. I know that in our minds, the most recent memory of Notre Dame is not a happy one, and it's linked to the fire that happened last year in April. It started on the 15th of April and was finally put out on the 16th. So it lasted a night and part of a day. The fire brigade did an amazing job with taming this fire that started in the roof structure of Notre Dame. And I have a picture of the before. This was the roof structure of Notre Dame, nicknamed the forest for the sheer number of trees that had to be cut and used to create these beams and this very intricate structure. The amazing thing is that until last year, the structure was the original one. And Notre Dame was built in the Middle Ages. So we're talking about wooden beams that have been there since the 1200s. And now it's all gone. The roof has completely burned down. In the wake of the fire, the government promised the French that Notre Dame will be rebuilt within 5 years of this devastating fire. But then later on, they discovered that in nowadays France, there are no trees old enough and so tall enough to recreate the exact same structure as the roof had before the fire. So they will have to come up with newer, different technologies to form a cover for the building. Now, on a happier note, what remains of Notre Dame, what has survived the fire, the beautiful, very distinctive, unique gargoyles of the church. Gargoyles and chimeras, and we see the difference very well in this photo. The ones to the left are actual gargoyles, and a gargoyle, I don't know if you know, it's an architectural feature that has a decorative function. So they are sculpted into figures or into animals or into fantastic beasts, but they also have a technical function. So they help with rainwater. They help protruding it as far as possible from the building, because otherwise, in time, water running exactly along the walls of the building would eat up the plaster that keeps the stones together. So to avoid this, in the Middle Ages, they thought of gargoyles, which are, again, protruding elements. They always have their mouth open because they have a channel in their back where the water can flow and then exit through the mouth. So these are gargoyles. The one on the right is what we call a chimera. We can tell it's not a gargoyle. It doesn't protrude from the building. Its mouth is closed. It doesn't really have any function. A chimera, it's just a sculpture that is placed outside of a building, and it only has, again, a decorative function. The curiosity about the gargoyles of Notre Dame, which are so famous and always very recognizable in pictures because, again, made of a unique design, is that they were not part of the original Notre Dame. So they were not something that was done in the Middle Ages. They were added later on during the 1800s when Notre Dame was heavily restored, and the architect who did the restoration thought that they would give a very middle-aged look to the place. So they were a feature invented in the Middle Ages, but the ones that we have in Notre Dame are not from the Middle Ages. For the ones of you who will visit Paris in the future, I do have my first suggestion for today, which is, maybe you didn't know, but you can go up one of the two bell towers that are in the front of the cathedral. And if you ascend it, you get all the way to the level that they call the balcony of the gargoyles. So these photos were taken from there, and you can see how close up you can get to admire the different details also of all the gargoyles, other than, of course, enjoying a beautiful view over Paris. Next chapter, novelty or the Renaissance times. Now, in the Renaissance times, Paris looked like this. This is a drawing that shows us what the island of the city, we are still on the little island in the middle of the river, looked like in the 1400s. But all the city looked like this, also on the banks of the river, not just the island. So a lot of houses, spaces are very crammed with constructions. Even the bridges are filled with buildings and not left open. And in fact, it is a bridge that is one of the very few things that remain in Paris from the Renaissance times, because the city was very heavily renewed in later times. So very few things remain. And it is this bridge which connects the two banks of the river, passing through the tip, one of the two pointy ends of the island. It's called Pont Neuf, which in French means the new bridge, which I think it's a nice little name for the oldest bridge in town. Nowadays, it's the oldest. Of course, the name comes from when it was firstly built. And it was a new bridge because it was built in a new way. And it was the first in many things. It was the first bridge being built all out of stone. Until that time, during the Middle Ages, bridges were made out of wood. And if any of you has ever been to Florence and seen the Ponte Vecchio, or to Venice and seen the Rialto Bridge, both of which were built in the Middle Ages, you will remember that the bridges are lined with constructions on both sides. So this was the very first bridge to be built all free of constructions. It was built again in stone. It was the first place in Paris to have a sidewalk, a paved sidewalk. So imagine what it must have been like for pedestrians in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance times, when so very few roads were paved, just to walk in the street. It was all muddy, especially when it rained. It was very dirty, excrements that people threw out of their windows, animals everywhere. So it must have really been yucky to walk in the street at those times. And Parisians on this bridge could enjoy a paved sidewalk. This was made the bridge so important that it became the core of Parisian social life for a couple of centuries, really. So on this bridge, there were displays of justice with gallows put up on the sides. Acrobats were doing their shows. Merchants would sell their goods. And it was the only place in town, really, where just by walking along it, people from different social classes could meet. And we are left with a beautiful quote regarding the bridge that goes, "I didn't know what it meant to be a Parisian until I walked across the Pont Neuf," which was uttered by none other than your very own Benjamin Franklin, who spent several years in Paris as an ambassador to France, came to love the city very much, and had to say this about the new bridge. The Pont Neuf also gives me the chance to talk to you about my second suggestion, which is take a cruise along the river. I always do it when I'm in Paris on my own, when I'm not there for work. It is something that I truly think makes a trip to Paris special. And I use the bridge to trigger this suggestion because from the base of one of the pillars starts the cruise of one of the boat companies that there are several in Paris. This one is my personal favorite, but they all run the same type of cruises. It's a 1-hour cruise. And in the case of this specific supplier, this would be the itinerary. So you would be starting with the boat where you see the black dot exactly at the tip of the island. You would cruise along the river all the way to the Eiffel Tower, turn around, come back. Of course, on the way and back, you would be admiring all the monuments lit up, if you do it at night, that overlook the water. And then go around the island so that you can also see Notre Dame from every angle, and then get back to the pier to disembark. So again, it's a 1-hour cruise. It's very cheap. It gives you a newer perspective on things that you might have seen during the day just by walking through the streets. And again, I think it's very, very worth it. Next chapter in Paris's history, I called it Overturning because, of course, we're talking about the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is linked specifically to a building, this palace. The name is Conciergerie. It's a palace that it's way older than the Revolution. The Revolution happened at the end of the 1700s. This is a medieval palace, so it was built way before. And it served as a royal palace for the French kings for many centuries until they left for a newer location. When this happened, the palace became the seat of justice, the main tribunal in Paris. And during the French Revolution, it served as a prison for all the hundreds of people who didn't agree with the values of the revolutionaries were found and kept in the prison awaiting trial, a trial that would have one of only two possible outcomes. You were either innocent, or if you were found guilty, you would be beheaded by the infamous guillotine, the contraptment that was designed by a French doctor, actually to make it less painful to be beheaded, because until that time you would be beheaded by sword, and sometimes, you know, it wasn't at the first hit that you would die. So the guillotine was kind of a bettering of the condition of people who had to be executed. The prison in the Conciergerie was left as it was during the Revolution, so you can visit it and you can see the different types of cells that the prison offered. So starting top left, the worst type, you see no bed, floor strewn with hay, and you would probably be thrown in there with another 20 or so people, so not very comfortable. It was, of course, for the poorest of prisoners who didn't count a thing. and they were nicknamed oubliettes, which always gives me the chills. In French, it means forgotten places. So we can, infer the destiny that awaited these prisoners. The second type, top right, was a little better. If you had a little money that you could use to bribe the guards, you would have a little bed, maybe a desk, a chair, and be only, share your cell only with another prisoner. And then let's say the luxurious type of cells, the ones at the bottom, individual cells for the prestigious prisoners. So people with a lot of money who could really bribe the guards, or nobility, and of course, royalty. They would have a little more liberty other than having an individual cell. So they could have visitors, they could have books and food brought to them. And so they would have a little bit of a different experience than the prisoners kept in the first two types of cells. Of course, the most famous and prestigious prisoner who was kept in here is definitely her, Marie Antoinette, the last queen of the French. They wrote books about her, movies about her. They attribute to her quotes that she never said, like, let them eat cake. She never said, let them eat cake, but she became a very famous historical figure. And she spent almost 3 months in the prison of the Conciergerie before she was beheaded. We know she was beheaded. She was found guilty of all charges because she was royalty, basically, and brought to where the guillotine was. She left behind a couple objects, like the vest that she wore during those 76 days in the prison to the left, and one of her slippers. And this was the place where the guillotine was in Paris. So this square overlooking the water of the river, to the bottom right corner, you see, maybe you can tell, that's an obelisk that marks the center of the square. So we see only part of the square. And the guillotine was placed here in the open air so that people could assist whenever someone was executed by guillotine. After the revolution comes the restoration. So the age of the empire, when nobility takes back control and restores itself to their ancient glory and power. And I thought that the place in Paris that mostly embodies the grandeur of the empire and its willingness to show might and powerfulness was this avenue that was created in those times, at the end of the 1700s. The French call it the Champs-Élysées, the Elysian fields. So in the minds of the creators, they would really be a paradise on earth. And this photo was taken from the top of another famous Parisian monument, the Arc de Triomphe, the Triumphal Arch, that is at one end of this avenue. And they run all the way with no obstacles, all the way to that building that you see in the distance with the blackish rooftops, and that is the Palace of the Louvre. Nowadays, this avenue, or boulevard, as the Parisians call it, is one of the main shopping districts in Paris. It's a very glamorous place, even just to stroll up and down. And so I thought that maybe taking a look at the couple of boutiques, of historical boutiques that are along it would be fun. So this is one of them, Guerlain. Guerlain is a French perfume maker, a French perfume brand. It's a very important one because founded in 1828, Monsieur Guerlain himself, the founder, was the first perfume maker in history. So he started perfumery. They own this beautiful building. We see the facade and the entrance in this photo, and the inside is fantastic. They have all sorts of rooms with marble everywhere, beautiful lighting, and all the little bottles of their fragrances displayed. It is very glamorous to own and use a Guerlain perfume. If when you're in Paris next time you want to buy one, just know that the prices range from a minimum of 200 to 700 at the same measure, the same amount of perfume, $700. And that's the most expensive one I could find, but maybe it goes even higher than that. Another iconic brand in France is definitely Louis Vuitton, that we've all heard of. They own this building, the entire building on a corner of the Champs-Élysées, that they turned into their main flagship store around the world. It's the biggest one. Now, Louis Vuitton is another very, very ancient French brand. It was born in 1854, founded by, of course, Mr. Vuitton, and he became famous. His success was based on a new design that he had conceived for luggage. So he redesigned suitcases. Until his time, suitcases had a roundish top so that water from rain, if it rained, could flow easily along the sides and not wet too much the suitcase. He thought, genius that he was, of designing a flat-topped suitcase. So we are at a time when planes are not a thing yet, but people travel by train, by boat, and the fact that these flat suitcases were stackable, one on top of the other, really made a difference. So he had a stellar success. He patented his logo, the LV, that we know so well today. And after a while, of course, Louis Vuitton, the brand, started also making other things. They went into accessories, shoes, clothing lines. Mainly today, they are famous for their purses, a big status symbol. And even for the Louis Vuitton purses, again, you would have to spend a lot of money. But I did discover that it is cheaper to buy them in France than in the US. So because you get your tax return. So if you if you have planned a trip to Paris and you really want a Louis Vuitton purse, that would be the occasion to get it. Just to let you know, prices range from a minimum of $300 to $3,500 for a purse. So again, a lot of dough. Now, for our first pit stop, I chose a place along the avenue of the Champs-Élysées, another beautiful, beautiful venue with this splendid design. The place is called La Durée. It is another old French brand, and they are into bakery and pastry making. So La Durée has this beautiful shop. It's the biggest one they have, but it's definitely not the only one. They have shops all throughout the world. It is a very famous brand nowadays. Inside, they have, of course, a counter with the display of all the pastries that they make, where you can just buy things to take away. But for our pit stop, I thought we would go one floor up and enjoy the spectacular tea room that they have on the second floor, all furnished in this beautiful style that is called Empire. So you see with the stuccos and the golden mirrors and chandeliers. If you do want to visit this shop when you're in Paris next, my advice is use the restrooms. And I don't want to sound like the poor countryside girl who gets to the city and is impressed by a bathroom, but the style that you see in this room was employed also to design and build the bathrooms in La Durée. So it is really a spectacular restroom. So even if you don't have to go, you want to visit it. I couldn't find a picture of the inside of the restrooms, otherwise I would have shown, but you have this little surprise for your next Paris visit. And as to what we could order, I thought of a mid-afternoon sweet snack. So the signature pastry at La Durée is definitely macaron. Now, macaron is a little cookie sandwich. For the ones of you who have never seen them, the dimensions are that of an Oreo, more or less, maybe a little fatter, but more or less. And so it's two cookies held together by a sort of custard or cream. Now, the cookies are made out of whipped egg whites, so they're very airy and light. And the main ingredient in the dough is almond flour. So they're very almondy in taste. And this is a very old ancient recipe that you find all throughout Europe. So it wasn't the cookie itself that was invented at La Durée. It was the idea of pairing two together with originally a chocolate custard holding them together. So this little sandwich idea was what Mr. La Durée invented in the 1800s. And so they have the right, to the paternity of this little sweet treat. If you take them away with you, instead of eating them at the premises, they come into these cute little boxes that hold them exactly. Now, La Durée is the most famous macaron maker in the world, but they are definitely not the only ones. Macarons are everywhere in France. So it's not only in this place that you find them. You see them in every pastry shop window. If you don't like almonds, maybe, or you don't like the idea of trying the macaron, I thought of another two very typical French desserts that we could try together. One is crème brûlée. Now, crème brûlée is a little cup filled with custard, which is the crème part. And then brûlée in French means burnt, because the little cup of custard gets topped with a layer of brown sugar. And the sugar then gets burnt with a little pastry torch, so an open flame. And by getting burnt, it gets caramelized and it becomes this glassy almost top over the custard. So you have to break it with your little spoon to get to the custard. And you see it in a picture, you see it oozes out. It's fantastic. It's super sweet. It's super sugary dessert. So if you have a sweet tooth, this would be a good choice. The other dessert that I thought of, my personal favorite, because I don't have much of a sweet tooth, is tarte tatin. And I know you guys know what an upside down pie is. So this is basically an upside down apple pie. And it gets done by layering the pan with caramel. And then you put your apples, either sliced like the ones in the photo, or halved, even just halved. And then you cover the pan with a very flaky pastry and you cook it in the oven. When it's ready, you flip it and you've got, the caramel all melted and beautifully warm. And let me tell you, in the establishments that really do it as they should, they serve it warm and either with a dollop of freshly whipped heavy cream, or as in the picture, with a scoop of ice cream. So you also have the contrast between the coldness of the cream or the ice cream and the warmth of the pie. It's fantastic. Mouth-watering, really. So after our pit stop, our next chapter, progress or the 1800s. And let me tell you, the 1800s is really the century that shaped Paris in the way that we enjoy it today. So the face that Paris has today really came from the 1800s. It's a very, very important century for Parisian history, especially for the novelties that started happening here. We are looking at two photos showing us the very first street lamps, gas street lamps, of course, no electricity yet. Paris was the first city ever to have public illumination. And this fact and this time is when Paris gets called Ville Lumière, the illuminated city, the city of lights. It's because of this. Another great innovation of the 1800s is the movies. So moving images on a screen. The photo shows us what is called the cinématographe. So the movies, the movie theater of the Lumière. The Lumière were the brothers who invented the machine, the camera, that could capture very quickly shots one after the other, and that could also then project them in movement on a screen. The two brothers, we see them in the photo standing up. They are the two men on the left standing up. And the photo is a fantastic original image of the very first time in history when a paying public sat in front of a screen to see moving pictures. So we are looking at the birth of movie theaters as venues and also of the technique of movies. Because movie theaters were not a thing yet, the venue for this occasion that was chosen for this occasion was they rented out one room of a cafe that still today exists. So it is a place that one can visit. And there is a little funny anecdote regarding the very first instances when movies were projected for a public. These were not long movies. They were very short clips of a minute and 10 seconds. And they didn't have, of course, a director, a screenplay writer. They didn't have a story invented. They were just showing moments of everyday life. So people didn't come for the story. They came for the novelty of seeing photographs in movement. And one of these very first clips by the brothers was this, just a frame, but in the links that Mara will send out after the presentation, I included the whole clip so you can see it, titled The Arrival of a Train at a City Called La Ciotat. So it's a very short 1 minute thing that shows a train approaching a platform, stopping, letting people off and on, and then starting to move again towards the public, towards the screen. What happened when this was first shown is that people evidently didn't grasp yet the concept of moving images on a flat screen. So when the train started moving again towards the spectators, people ran screaming for their lives out of the room because they were convinced that the train was actually there and that it would, come through the screen and crash them to death. So it took a while for this novelty. Now, of course, probably the most iconic monument of this time, and maybe of all times in Paris, is the Eiffel Tower, built during this century. It was decided for a specific occasion, the World's Fair. This is a flyer for the World's Fair of 1889, when Paris housed it. So Parisians wanted a monument built that would welcome the visitors, that would flock to Paris all throughout the year to visit the World's Fair. And that would be the perfect showcasing of the state of the art in architecture and design in Paris until that time. So the newest building technique and the newest of materials, steel, they wanted them to be employed for building this monument. But for the French and Paris specifically, that year was also important because it marked the 100 years anniversary from the French Revolution. So they wanted really this monument to commemorate both events, the 100-year-old one and the contemporary one. And that's why they went big. Now, this beautiful image shows us the sequence of images show us the different stages of construction of the tower, which took a little over 2 years to be completed, which is really impressive. The name that we linked to the tower, Eiffel, was left behind by an engineer, a French engineer, who was not the one who designed the Eiffel Tower, though. He was the one who paid for the construction of the Eiffel Tower. He was a very rich industrial businessman. He was already very famous at the time. He dabbled a lot in the more modern construction techniques and the more modern materials. He was already well known in the US for being the engineer who had designed the iron skeleton that is inside the Statue of Liberty. So he was already famous worldwide when he paid for the construction of the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower was supposed to be a temporary structure. It was supposed to stay for 20 years, and then it was supposed to be dismantled. But even though it was met at the beginning with very heavy criticism by Parisians and Frenchmen in general, after 20 years, when it was time to take it down, evidently it had become so much part of the landscape that Parisians were used to and maybe even affectionate about, that it was decided that they would keep it, thankfully. It was also a very useful building. It was the tallest in the world for 40 some years until the Chrysler building was built in New York City in 1930. So it kept the mantle for a while. And because of the height, the sheer height, it was possible to use this structure for scientific experiments. So for instance, regarding weather forecasting or the force of the wind or height, and even for wireless radio communications. In fact, one of the stories regarding the Eiffel Tower happens during World War II, when during the Nazi occupation of Paris, Hitler visited the city in 1940 and expressed the desire of ascending at the top of the Eiffel Tower. But when he arrived at the monument, the workers, they told him that unfortunately the elevators were out of order. And he thought about it for a second, and then he decided he wouldn't climb the 1,700 and some steps all the way to the summit, and he would just admire it from beneath it, from the ground level. And as soon as he went about his business in Paris, and as soon as he left France, they turned back on the elevators. So it had been a lie. And it had been a lie because at the very top of the Eiffel Tower, the French had placed an antenna that served the function of intercepting and listening into Nazi spies' communications, which was a tool that helped them uncover and, of course, capture many spies. And of course, they didn't want the Führer himself to discover the antenna on top. It worked. This is the view that Adolf Hitler couldn't enjoy. At the very top of the Eiffel Tower, you've got this beautiful view. This, of course, is just one side. It is a 360 degrees view all over the city. Whenever I am in Paris with some clients and they express the wish to ascend the tower, I always advise them to use another venue. If you look in the photo, the tallest building that we see right in front of the Eiffel Tower, it's a skyscraper called the Montparnasse Tower. It's very close. It's not as far away as it looks in the picture. And it is an office building, but the very last floor, the 56th, is left as a panoramic deck. So all the walls are glass, and you can ascend it, and you really enjoy the same view, basically, than you have at the Eiffel Tower, but with one main difference, and which is the reason for my advice, that from the Montparnasse Tower, this is your view. So you do see also the Eiffel Tower in front of you, whereas if you ascend to the Eiffel Tower, you're on top of it and you don't get to see it. So the view from the Montparnasse Tower is fantastic. They were supposed to restore it right before the COVID happenings. So now everything is stalled, and we don't know if they will reopen and just postpone the renovations, or if they will wait for a while and renovate it right away. But if you're curious, you can, look online to see if it's open next time you're in Paris. If that time coincides with mid-July, I also wanted to let you know that on the 14th of July, Parisians and in general in France, they celebrate what they call Bastille Day. Bastille Day is a day that commemorates an event that happened during the French Revolution, the event that sparked actually the French Revolution. And they have beautiful firework displays all over the country, really. And in Paris, they are really spectacular. It looks a little bit like your 4th of July. So this photo was taken from the Montparnasse Tower, the top of the Montparnasse Tower, with a very powerful zoom, but it does give you an idea of the view. We cannot, of course, cap the 1800s off without talking about probably the most famous current in art history, which is Impressionism, born in France and very controversial at the beginning. It's very difficult, of course, to talk about Impressionism in just a couple words, but very, very briefly, what Impressionists had in mind was to break with tradition. The tradition that was symbolized by the Academy of Arts. So they wanted to start painting in the open air, in a spontaneous way, not following strict ancient rules. They wanted to observe real life happening in front of them and capture it on their canvases right away. almost simultaneously, and they were very, very interested in capturing light and the different effects that light has with shadows and on the different scenes. So more or less, let's say that this is Impressionism. And there is a place in Paris that is very much linked to the birth of Impressionism. This neighborhood called Montmartre. At the time, the hill where the neighborhood is on was outside of the city borders. So it was a very cheap place to live compared to the city, because it didn't have the same amount of taxes due to the city. So the different artists flocking to Paris from all over Europe, really, that didn't have much money, decided to use Montmartre as the place to live and also to work out of. So their studios were also here. The hill nowadays is part of the city. It is one of the neighborhoods of Paris. It is topped by this very, very white church called the Sacred Heart, the Holy Heart. Someone studied it, and the result is that this is the whitest monument in Europe. For some reason, someone decided to study the whiteness of monuments in Europe. You can reach the top of the hill and the church, of course, with these beautiful terraced staircases on the front of the hill. But Montmartre has a history that started in the 1800s and became the center of nightlife in Paris in those years because of cabaret. Cabaret were venues invented at this time. We see in the picture one of the most famous one, the Chat Noir, the entrance, and of course, one that we have all heard of, maybe because of the very recent movie Moulin Rouge. The cabaret was a place where you could have dinner, where alcohol was served, so you could also drink liquor. And during dinner, you would have a show going on that you could enjoy. And the show was basically dancing and singing. And there was a specific dance that was born in those years, invented by the French, that they called cancan. And you see two images of dancers from those times. In the links that I sent out, I included a couple of clips of dancers doing the cancan, so you can see the movements also. But you see from the pictures, basically, if the higher up you could kick your leg, the better you were at cancan. Some of the artists who made Montmartre their home, Pablo Picasso, a very young Picasso, his study can still be visited in one of the small squares of Montmartre. And then we have Renoir to the left and Van Gogh to the right, both of which were residents of the neighborhood at some point. Nowadays, if you visit Montmartre, you will see street artists all over the place. This is the main square, the main touristic, let's say, square in the neighborhood on the hill called the Place du Tertre. If you cross Place du Tertre, you will see hundreds of artists with all their easels up, painting, drawing, and you will be asked plenty times if you want your portrait done or your caricature done. And I did once. I said yes once. Why not? I had my portrait done. It was fun. It took maybe 10, 15 minutes. The guy was really good. And they never have a set price. They always show you what they did after they're done, and they tell you to decide what it is worth. And it's usually very cheap. You can go for 10, 15, 20 euros. And I think it's a nice souvenir to bring back, you know, because it's very, very unique. It's going to be a unique thing that only you have. Lastly, regarding Montmartre, this is a vineyard, the only one remaining from a time when the hill was completely covered by vineyard before they started building on the hill. So this is the very last remain of those times. And it is a vineyard where they still produce wine. They say it's very good. I've never tried it, but they say it's a really good red and a rosé that they make. Next chapter. Controversy is the 20th century for me. Of course, in the 1900s, so many events happened and it was difficult to choose. We have the two world wars, of course. We have the Cold War. We have the social revolts of 1968, which sparked from Paris. But because, of course, the key of our presentation tonight is mostly architectural, artistic, and historical, I decided that the fact that would symbolize this time in Paris is the controversy that they had, sparked by a few buildings that were built in these years by young architects with really futuristic designs that were, at the beginning at least, were met with many criticisms. Only two examples. This is the Musée d'Orsay. It is a beautiful museum that was opened in the 1980s. And the building was there way before. It was a train station originally. So this young architect, she was an Italian architect, decided to keep the whole building as a frame and just redesign the interior to make it ready to house the collection, which, by the way, it's the Impressionist collection that Paris has. And it is a really vast, comprehensive, beautiful collection. So this is also a place that's very much worth visiting. A photo that shows us what the place looked like in the inside when it was a train station. And also a photo from the outside, because I really think this building is breathtaking. And it is one of the monuments that you can enjoy if you take one of those cruises that I was talking about at the very beginning of tonight's event, because it's, as you can see, it's built right on the water. It's right on the bank, so you see it very, very well. The other example, talking about controversy in Paris in these years, is the pyramid at the Louvre, built again in the 1980s by a Chinese architect. The construction was asked for by the president of the French Republic. They needed a newer, easier entrance for visitors, for the millions and millions of people who visit the Louvre every year. So the pyramid today serves as the entrance to the museum. What happened when they unveiled it first is that people didn't like how much it is in contrast, you know, the modernity of the glass structure with how classical the Louvre building is. And you see it well in this picture. The pyramid is right smack in the middle of the courtyard. So it is surrounded by the different wings of the Louvre Palace. Now they came to like it. I think it's beautiful, but of course, as in all things artistic, it is a matter of personal opinion. If you haven't visited the Louvre, you probably saw an image of the pyramid. It is a very, very famous landmark in Paris nowadays. But if you haven't visited, you probably don't know that there is a perfect opposite of the pyramid underground. It is called the upside down pyramid, and it protrudes downwards into the hall that is the actual entrance to the galleries of the Louvre Museum. Finally, last chapter, the 21st century, but also a little peek into what the future of Paris might be. And for these years, the 2000s, I chose three aspects that not only the city, but the mentality of the city administration embodies very, and embraces very strongly nowadays. The first being fashion. Fashion, of course, it's a very old French tradition. It wasn't born yesterday. Paris is part of a circuit of 4 cities that are the 4 most important hubs, let's say, of fashion throughout the world, together with New York City, London, and Milan. It houses twice a year the Fashion Week, the Paris Fashion Week, where the different designers present their seasonal collections. Again, fashion for the French is a very ancient tradition, but in these last years, they did give it a modern spin. It is getting updated. So these 2 photos are from Paris's Fashion Week of 2019 in the fall. They are always housed in the Louvre, in the museum's environments. But last year, they did something more than usual. They had an event that was called the Fashion Clothes Piece. And it was sponsored by an African fashion association to promote diversity in the fashion industry, because apparently, according to them, we are not yet at a good point from the point of view of diversity. So they organized a parallel fashion show within the Louvre. Many designers participated with their shows. And for these, they hired models of all ethnicities. So again, to promote diversity. Just as a funny note, at the Paris Fashion Weeks, she's always present. Now, for the ones of you who don't recognize her, she is the Devil Wears Prada, Ann Wintour, Vogue's America director. The second aspect of nowadays Paris that I chose is gastronomy. The food tradition is another very, very ancient, glorious tradition in France. So it is definitely not born these days. But again, the French, and Paris being the capital, first of all, tries to give a twist to the tradition that gastronomy is in France. And two are the places in Paris that I chose to represent the new twist that Paris gastronomy is taking these years. One is this lovely little place in Montmartre called Bijou. Even though the name is very, very French, the owner, chef, and starter of this place is an Italian. He is an Italian chef from Naples who does pizza. So his crazy idea when he opened up this place was, why can't pizza be considered high cuisine? If it's done properly with really high quality ingredients, respecting the traditional recipes, it can really get to the highest of levels when it comes to food. And he embodies one of the new criteria that French cuisine tries to look at, which is contamination. So different food cultures that enter into traditional French recipes or using traditional French ingredients. So what he does is he does pizza. Yes, he had an enormous success, especially with Parisians. So this might also be a suggestion for your next Paris trip of something really off the beaten path, where you would encounter only French people inside. He does pizza, but he does it by, in the dough, putting champagne. So he mixed one of the most iconic dishes from his homeland, Italy, the pizza, with one of the most iconic things that French cuisine has to offer, champagne. And it made a beautiful, mouth-watering result. If you read the reviews of this place, his pizzas, of course, he offers different type of toppings. His pizzas are referred to as 8-sliced jewelry. Fantastic. The second place that I think represents well nowadays French cuisine is a totally different type of venue, of course. This restaurant is called Les Meurices, and it is run and owned by chef Alain Ducasse. Now, this is a 2-starred, 2 Michelin-starred restaurant. So again, we are talking about another standard. But Alain Ducasse is probably the main living French chef nowadays in the world. So he really symbolizes all that French cuisine has to offer nowadays. The other criteria that gastronomy in Paris and France in general respect or try to respect nowadays, other than contamination that we talked about already, are seasonality of ingredients, that they are as much as possible farm to table and organically sourced. And this is all respected in this place. A dish ordered at Les Meurices might look like this. So this is something that they serve at this restaurant. It is not only, you see, the choice of the highest quality possible ingredients, but it is also, you know, with an eye to the presentation. The dishes look more like paintings than things that you want to eat. And given that this chef, Alain Ducasse, is really embodies French gastronomy nowadays, I also wanted to show you what he's been doing recently. He started a partnership with NASA to design dishes, high quality dishes, to be then tinned and sent to the astronauts who live on the ISS, the International Space Station. Now, this is not the first time that this type of partnership happens. There was an Italian chef quite some years ago who started this type of research, but it's to, you know, have an idea of what the future of gastronomy might be. Lastly, regarding nowadays Paris, sustainability is probably the biggest of the aspects that Parisians always have in mind. Paris was the first city, for instance, to invent the concept of public bicycles, so owned by the city, and rentable. You find them all throughout the city, parked, locked. You unlock them with an app on your phone. You pay with your credit card. It's just exactly as renting a car. You pay by the time that you use it, and you can park it where you arrive. You don't have to take it back. So the vélo was called. It was a big success in Paris, so much so, this was invented 20 years or so ago, so much so that they now have an even more contemporary idea, which is the scooters. Again, publicly owned, available all throughout the city. If you visit Paris nowadays, you see hundreds of people zooming around on the scooters. But sustainability is also the mark of Paris 2024. They will house the Olympic Games. I think it's kind of neat because they housed the games in 1924 the first time. So it will mark the 100-year anniversary from the first time that they did. And they won with a project they did together with WWF that was all about sustainability. So for instance, private cars will be banned, and the venues where the games will be held are all within 30 minutes by bicycle from the center of town. They will try to avoid building new buildings, new venues, and use the ones that they already have in the city. They will provide clean means of transportation for the general public, so hybrid or metro and train. And they aim at cutting at least by 55% the emissions of greenhouse gas when compared to the games in London 2012 and Rio 2016. So this is really the mark of their project. This is the design that the athletes quarter will have in Paris. So you see the materials are all sustainable materials and a lot of greenery. And to finish off with what Paris might look like in the future, this is a design by a very famous contemporary French architect who had a vision. This is not going to happen necessarily, but this is how he imagines Paris will look like in the future. This employing greenery, vertical greenery in constructions already happens throughout the world. I'm from Milan, and in my city, we already have 2 skyscrapers that are called vertical forests. So we do already employ this type of technique, and this architect specializes in it. So his idea for a futuristic Paris would be this. Now, to end our virtual visit of Paris, one last pit stop, my little Easter egg would be dinner, because I imagined we would end our day together by having something to eat together. And I thought that crepes would be a good idea. The quote says, "I think I found the taste of happiness." Funny, it's exactly that of crepes. There's nothing probably more French than crepes. And I found a venue, a place where we would be having this view had we been sitting at their outside table. So right underneath the Eiffel Tower. The place is this. It's called Les Frères Bretons, which means the Brittany brothers, because crepes are a traditional recipe coming from the northern region of Brittany. So they're not from Paris originally, but nowadays you find them everywhere in Paris. We could choose from a range of possible fillings, from the savory ones all the way to the sweet ones. This has salted caramel sauce and whipped cream. But my suggestion would be to end your meal, at least end your meal with this. This is a crêpe Suzette. It's a specific way of cooking the crepe. It's a sweet one. It has a little alcohol, and they serve it at the table by inflaming it. So it's very theatrical, you know, to look at someone preparing a crêpe Suzette. And one of the links that I will send out later is the preparation of a crêpe Suzette, because it's really beautiful to see it happening while they are doing it instead of just in a still photo. So I am finished, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I found this nice quote from Sabrina, Audrey Hepburn in Sabrina: "Paris is always a good idea." And I hope tonight was no exception. Thank you.